Okay guys, so in this video we have added support to mark something as important. So let's walk through it. So these buttons here represent important in our application. So if I click this star now, we can actually see that it's going yellow, there's no alert anymore, anything like that. And if we go into the network tab here, we can see that when we actually do that, we see that there's a request here, and our response is that, hey, is important is true. If I click it again, it's going to go and say is important false. So now we have a way of modeling this. And we've also added support to go to the important tab and actually see the things that are important. But if I deselect this and I go back there again, there's nothing there anymore. So that's the basic functionality. So let's have a look at the code. Now, don't panic. Like, all of these files here is just me renaming some stuff because I noticed that I, in my fallacy as a human being, had started two conventions at the same time where, hey, I used snake case and camel case, and I just thought to myself, well, let's just stick with camel case and just let that be the end of it, even though snake case is pretty nice as well. So let's look at the application first and foremost. The main things that we can see here in our diff that has changed is that, hey, we have this new import called validate incoming important request. And then we have a slight update here to important emails. And basically what's happening there is that we have a new function that simply says get important emails. That's about it. And then down here we have this little section which is where we now post our new request. So let's examine that just a little bit closer. We go down here and we can see that, okay, so we have this URL here where we specify that we want to go to email/email ID because we need to identify the email that we actually want to set as important, and then just /important. And in here we also have this little function called validate incoming request or important request. And all this is going to do is that it's just going to validate that the post that we're getting actually contains an is important field variable, or like a variable that holds a Boolean value, and that's about it. Just to do that validation, because remember, we need to always validate the inputs that comes from an external source into our system. It's a very good practice, because otherwise, in this scenario, it might not be much of a problem, but you should always have that as a rule. Always do it, because you want to know what's coming into your system. In other scenarios where you might have sensitive information, you might actually find that you can actually exploit this information. It's actually funny because now that I think about it, this, in theory, that is important variable, that field could, in theory, contain a string. And since if our JavaScript code, I mean, a very classic example of this is that you simply treat things as falsy or truthy, but any string will be a truthy value. So unless you specify that you need a Boolean, and somebody could send a string, for example, and maybe get, like in this case, Mongoose actually extracts, or rather escapes this information, so it's not much of a problem. But in theory, they could start adding some type of exploits through this property here. But anywho, set email as important is the method that we call on the email service. So if we now look at the email service here, there's a few things that's happened since last time. So we have these two new methods up here, get important emails and set email as important. So let's actually look at those. So we added them with our binds up here, and this is hopefully fairly straightforward. All we're going to do is that we're going to go and do a find, and we're just going to get everything that is set as important. Easy peasy. And then set email as important is fairly straightforward as well. We take the email ID, we find that email ID, and then we simply set is important to either true or false, depending on what we get. And then finally we simply save, and that's the end of the story. So, and yeah, that's virtually it. And then we have a few tests here. We can actually just scroll through these. So the email server now, I added like a few tests here. I remember I forgot to create this test for create draft emails and so forth. But yeah, I don't think that we need to touch all that much on testing. But it's, as I've said before, it's important for you to add tests as you go along. And if you work in a test-driven fashion, you should of course write your tests before you actually write code. And yeah, and then we have a test that just validates, or very similar to the one we have for incoming emails, but this one just validates the incoming is important request. And then we've added some logic to our inbox row icon, or inbox row icon component. So quite a few things have changed here, as you can see. So let's just walk through that actually. Let's look at the diff very quickly here. So we can see that we have a few imports here. We've added our props correctly because I forgot to do that. And then we have this thing here, which is just setting the default state. So if I go in here, you will now see that, all right, so we initialize each of these inbox row icons. And remember, this is the component that you see here. This is that component right there. So we set is important based on the props that we pass in, because the props that we are going to pass in is just going to be an email basically. And then we check this thing. Component will receive props. So whenever this component receives new props, in other words, I update something. So example, I click here and then I go to important. Now this is basically going to give this specific component a new set of properties, and that's what we were doing here. So we go and check what the next properties are going to be. We simply extract is important from that and we set that on the state. And then we have an onClick function, and basically all that's going to do is it's going to check this local state for is important, just invert whatever that is. And then we set the state, and then we set email to we create a set email to important request, which is just this very simple object right here. That's all it does. It's very similar to the thing in the other request we've already made. So finally, we have this new function called set email to important on the API, which is just a template function that takes in the email ID and returns the string as we saw earlier, which this maps to the server as we saw. And then finally we do a fetch. And the reason why we're using state in this scenario is because we don't want, we want the sensation of actually setting something to important to feel instantaneous. Now, as I said, if I click here and if I just click on and off, I don't want to delay the actual sensation for the user. I just want to immediately flip this thing, right? And if we wanted to improve this a little bit, we should probably add a try-catch of some sort here, because this in theory could fail, so I might add that in as well before I start on the next thing, but that's a separate thing. And yeah, that's about it. I think we have a spec file here with a few basic tests for this request that we construct, and yeah, I think that's about it. So now we have that functionality in, and we can reward ourselves by moving this card over to testing. And then we will add support to view spam, I suppose. But then again, let's ask this fundamental question: how will we receive spam? It's a little bit early for us to receive spam, I think. So maybe we'll shuffle that down a little bit and put that with the inbox, because these two are because the stuff that we've done so far is very easy for us to create and then test and so forth, because it's something that our user, the user of this application, is going to create by him or herself. But this is something that comes from an external party, which is going to be a little bit trickier. So let's look at reading an email, so we can finally actually click an email and actually see something besides this thing here. That's probably a good next step. So let's grab that one and let's take a look at that in the next video.